a shy cleaner gave a CEO's disabled son hope. His reaction shocked everyone. The hospital corridor was silent except for the rhythmic squeak of Maria's mop against the sterile floors. She moved like a shadow through the pediatric wing, her presence so unassuming that most people never noticed her at all. But on this particular Tuesday evening, as golden sunlight filtered through the tall windows, Maria paused outside room 447. Inside, a small boy sat motionless in his wheelchair, staring at the wall with eyes that had forgotten how to dream. She didn't know that this moment, this simple pause in her routine, would change both their lives forever. She didn't know that the powerful man who would soon discover what she'd done would be brought to his knees, not by corporate rivals or market crashes, but by the quiet courage of a woman the world had trained itself to overlook. Maria Santos had been invisible her entire life. At 42, she had perfected the art of moving through spaces without disturbing them, of existing without demanding acknowledgement. She cleaned the halls of Metropolitan Children's Hospital 5 nights a week, arriving after visiting hours when the families had gone home and the children lay sleeping or staring at ceilings that held no answers. She had emigrated from the Philippines 15 years ago with nothing but a battered suitcase and her mother's rosary, working 3 jobs to send money home to her aging parents and younger siblings. English came slowly to her, each word a small victory hard-won through late-night study sessions after exhausting shifts. Her shyness wasn't just a personality trait, it was armor built from years of being dismissed, overlooked, and reminded that people like her were meant to serve, not to be seen. But Maria had a secret that contradicted her invisible existence. She noticed everything. She saw the way Nurse Patterson's shoulders sagged on Thursday nights when her ex-husband had the kids. She noticed when Dr. Chen started wearing his wedding ring again after months of leaving it in his locker. And she especially noticed the children, those small warriors fighting battles that would break most adults. She learned their names even when no one introduced her. She remembered which ones were afraid of the dark, which ones missed their dogs, which ones pretended to be brave for parents who were barely holding together themselves. Room 447 belonged to Ethan Montgomery, though Maria didn't know his last name when she first saw him 3 months ago. She only knew that he was 7 years old, that he'd been in a car accident that left him paralyzed from the waist down, and that he never spoke anymore. The nurses whispered about him during shift changes. His mother had died in the same accident. His father, some important businessman, visited sporadically, always dressed in expensive suits, always on his phone, always leaving before he'd barely arrived. The boy had stopped doing his physical therapy. He'd stopped eating unless forced. He'd stopped being a child. Maria's heart broke for him in a way that transcended language barriers and social divides. One evening, as she cleaned his room while he stared blankly at the wall, she began to hum. It was unconscious at first, a melody from her childhood. A lullaby her own mother had sung when typhoons rattled their tin roof and fear made sleep impossible. She didn't realize Ethan had turned his head slightly, the first voluntary movement anyone had seen from him in weeks. The next night, she hummed again, and this time she saw the ghost of recognition in his eyes. On the third night, she brought out her old phone and played him a video of her village, of children playing in the rain, laughing as they splashed through puddles with an abandon that knew nothing of wheelchairs or losses too great to name. If this story is touching your heart, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to Kindness Pulse for more inspiring stories that remind us of the beautiful humanity we all share. Your support means the world and helps these stories reach others who need hope. What began as simple gestures grew into something neither of them expected. Maria started arriving 30 minutes early to her shift, time she couldn't afford to give but did anyway. She brought pictures of her family, her village, the ocean near her childhood home. She told him stories in her halting English about her own struggles, about leaving everything familiar behind, about how scared she'd been and still was sometimes. She didn't preach or therapize. She just showed him, through her own life, that surviving terrible things was possible, that moving forward didn't mean forgetting what you'd lost, that being broken didn't mean being finished. Slowly, impossibly, Ethan began to respond, first with eye contact, then with nods. Then, one miraculous evening 6 weeks after Maria had first hummed that lullaby, with words, "Will you come back tomorrow?" His voice was rusty, barely above a whisper, but it was a voice returning from the dead. Maria, tears streaming down her weathered face, nodded so vigorously that Ethan almost smiled. Almost. She helped him name his grief instead of drowning in it. She sat beside his wheelchair and talked about his mother, asking him to tell her stories, giving him permission to remember out loud. She celebrated microscopic victories when he picked up a spoon himself, when he laughed at one of her clumsy English mistakes, when he asked the physical therapist to show him an exercise. The nursing staff began to notice the change. Dr. Chen called it remarkable. Nurse Patterson called it a miracle. But they didn't know about Maria. Ethan's progress appeared in their charts as spontaneous recovery, the human spirit's mysterious resilience. No one thought to credit the cleaning lady. No one except Ethan. James Montgomery was a man who commanded boardrooms and moved markets with a phone call. But he couldn't reach his own son. The guilt was eating him alive. He'd been driving the night of the accident, distracted by a work call, and though he'd escaped with minor injuries, his wife hadn't survived, and Ethan's spine had shattered. He threw himself into work because it was the only place he still felt competent, but every visit to the hospital reminded him that he was failing at the only thing that truly mattered. When Dr. Chen called to say that Ethan was speaking again, engaging in therapy, showing dramatic improvement, James left a board meeting mid-sentence and drove to the hospital like a man possessed. He found his son in the common room, actually smiling as he maneuvered his wheelchair through an obstacle course, a young physical therapist cheering him on. James stood frozen in the doorway, afraid that if he moved or spoke, this vision would dissolve like every other hope had. But Ethan saw him, and for the first time in months, his face didn't close down. "Dad," he said simply. James crossed the room in 3 strides, dropping to his knees beside the wheelchair, pulling his son into his arms with the desperation that years of corporate control couldn't contain. "How?" he whispered into Ethan's hair. "How did this happen?" That's when Ethan told him about Maria, about the humming and the stories and the pictures, about how she saw him when everyone else, including his own father, had started to look away, about how she never pitied him but showed him her own scars instead, about how she made him believe that a different kind of life could still be a good life. James listened with tears running unchecked down his face. This powerful man brought low by the truth of his own absence and the grace of a stranger's presence. He found Maria 2 hours later, cleaning the 3rd-floor restrooms. She looked up startled when the door opened, then terrified when she recognized James Montgomery from the photographs in Ethan's room. She immediately began apologizing in rapid, nervous English, certain she'd broken some rule, crossed some line. But James couldn't speak. He just stood there in his $2,000 suit in the doorway of a hospital bathroom, looking at this small woman in a janitor's uniform, and saw someone infinitely greater than himself. When he finally found words, they came out broken. "You saved my son. You saved my son when I couldn't. When I didn't." Maria shook her head quickly. "No, number. I just talked to him. But James was pulling out his phone, his fingers shaking. "Please, whatever you need, a better job, money for your family, education, anything. Name it. I'll make it happen." Maria stepped back, actually frightened now, clutching her mop like a shield. This was the kind of attention she'd spent a lifetime avoiding. But James saw her fear and forced himself to slow down, to take a breath. "I'm sorry. I'm overwhelming you. I need to do something. I need to thank you somehow." What happened next shocked the hospital staff, the Montgomery family's social circle, and eventually, through local news coverage that James couldn't prevent, the entire city. James didn't offer Maria money and send her away. Instead, he asked her what she wanted, really wanted, if anything in the world were possible. And Maria, surprising herself, told him the truth. She wanted to go back to school. She'd been a teacher in the Philippines before emigrating, but her credentials weren't recognized here. She wanted to work with children again, especially children in hospitals. Children who were scared and alone. She wanted to matter in a way that was seen. James established a scholarship in his late wife's name, with Maria as its first recipient. He arranged for her to attend nursing school while working reduced hours with full benefits. He created a patient advocate position at the hospital specifically for her as someone to bridge the gap between the medical staff and families, especially immigrant families who felt lost in the system. But more than any of this, he brought her into his and Ethan's life. He invited her to family dinners. He listened to her stories. He learned about her culture, her struggles, her dreams. He showed his son that the measure of a person had nothing to do with their job title or bank account and everything to do with how they treated others when no one was watching. The hospital staff who had never noticed Maria suddenly saw her everywhere. The families she helped began telling their friends. Local news picked up the story of the cleaning lady who'd given a broken child hope and the CEO humble enough to recognize it. But Maria remained essentially unchanged by the attention. She still moved quietly through the world, still noticed the people others overlooked, still offered kindness like breathing. Before we close this story, if it moved you, please consider sharing it with someone who needs encouragement today. Like this video, comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to Kindness Pulse. Let's build a community that believes in the power of small acts of love to change everything. 2 years later, at Ethan's 9th birthday party, Maria stood slightly apart from the celebration, old habits of invisibility persisting. But Ethan, now walking with leg braces and determination that seemed to glow from within him, wheeled over to where she stood. "You're not invisible anymore, you know," he said with the blunt wisdom of childhood. "You never were to me." Maria smiled, tears threatening as they so often did around this boy who'd given her life as much meaning as she'd apparently given his. "You're not broken anymore either," she replied softly. Ethan considered this, then shook his head. "I think maybe we're both still a little broken. But maybe that's okay. Maybe broken people can help each other anyway." That night, after the guests had gone and James was putting Ethan to bed, the boy asked a question that would stay with his father forever. "Dad, do you think Mom sent Maria to us, like she knew we'd need her?" James smoothed his son's hair, his throat tight with emotion. "I think your mother would have loved her. And I think Maria taught us what your mother always knew, that the most important people in our lives might not be the ones everyone else sees. Sometimes they're the ones we almost miss. Sometimes they're the ones the world trains us to overlook." In the end, this is a story about sight, about truly seeing the people around us, especially those society renders invisible. Maria taught a grieving child that survival was possible not through grand gestures but through consistent, quiet presence. James learned that wealth and power meant nothing if they didn't make him available to what mattered. And Ethan discovered that sometimes the people who save us are the ones who need saving too, that healing is often mutual, that we're all more broken and more whole than we appear. The woman the world had trained to be invisible became unforgettable to the people who mattered most, and in choosing to see her, they learned to see themselves more clearly too. In a world that constantly tells us that importance comes from status, achievement, and recognition, Maria's story reminds us that the most profound impact often comes from the simplest source, one human being choosing to see another, to stay when leaving would be easier, to offer hope when hopelessness seems reasonable. That's not just kindness. That's revolution lived quietly, one hummed lullaby, one shared story, one moment of genuine connection at a time.